Chinaza stood once more at the edge of the office window, the city lights reflected in the glass like fractured stars. Odigu leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, observing her. "They'll respond," she said almost to herself. "Not necessarily to you, but to the ripple you've started." "Yes," he replied, voice calm. "It's not about response. It's about realignment. When perception shifts, architecture adjusts. Slowly, often invisibly." The phone rang. Odigu glanced at the caller ID, then gestured to her. She stepped aside and answered. The conversation was brief, clipped. A consultant, hesitant, confirming that preliminary findings aligned with the disclosed intersections. There were gaps. They needed access to correspondence, transaction logs, travel records. "Push it forward," Odigu said after she hung up. But quietly. "No leaks. Let them believe the initiative is routine. Perception of normalcy is fragile armor." Chinaza moved to the secure console and began drafting directives. By mid-morning, internal emails requested all communications related to advisory engagements from the last 3 years. Flags were set, exceptions noted, irregular patterns isolated. A knock at the office door drew their attention. One of the junior analysts entered, fidgeting. "Sir, there's a discrepancy in one director's declared associations. It's minor, but—" Odigu took the printed sheet, scanned the lines with slow precision. "Minor," he said evenly. "Minor is what people call the first crack in a dam. Track it. Every nuance matters. Nothing is minor when architecture is compromised." The analyst nodded, retreating. Chinaza watched him go. "You are threading them into a tight weave. They won't see it until they are caught." Odigu shook his head slightly. "No, not caught. Awakened. Structures awake themselves if prompted carefully. They'll adjust their behavior before the market even notices. That is power in subtlety." By late afternoon, the first visible shifts began. An independent counsel requested clarification on a previously unreported entity linked to the compromised director. Another board member canceled a private meeting abroad, citing internal obligations. The flow of decisions, once predictable, now curved subtly around undisclosed pressures. Chinaza noted each adjustment. She leaned back in her chair, silent, methodical. Odigu continued. "Observe how transparency, or even the hint of it, forces correction. People are opportunists by design. Corrective motion is instinctual when exposed to potential exposure." The following day, Odigu convened a discreet meeting with his internal audit lead and 2 senior analysts. "Expand the scope to include board-adjacent networks," he instructed. "Don't just track financial intersections. Map influence channels. Dinners, advisory forums, travel schedules, speaking engagements. Every touchpoint creates alignment or exposes misalignment." One analyst hesitated. "It's unprecedented in scale. It may cause alarm internally." "Good," Odigu said without inflection. "Alarm means awareness. Awareness precedes alignment. Misalignment is what destabilizes systems. We are not destabilizing. We are illuminating the structure itself." By evening, the subtle tremors became murmurs. Anonymous online reports referenced patterns of governance risk across multiple boards in similar sectors. The language was analytical, careful, and deliberately nonspecific. Yet, within the corridors of power, names were inferred, reputations recalibrated. A private call came in from one of the directors who had previously opposed Odigu's disclosures. "You've shifted the board's equilibrium," the voice admitted, tense. "They are talking. We cannot operate the same way. Trust is fragile." Odigu did not respond immediately. When he spoke, it was measured. "Trust fractures where clarity is absent. My goal is not fracture. It is visibility. The market reacts only to the perception of risk. Risk is present only where architecture is opaque." The director hesitated. "And if exposure becomes public? If the narrative runs ahead?" "Then the narrative always runs ahead," Odigu said evenly. "Our job is to anticipate, not chase. If the market moves before you, you are reacting. Reacting is vulnerability. The call ended. Chinaza observed him closely. They're frightened, she noted. Not frightened, Odigu corrected. Alert. Fear is emotional. Alert is structural. Alert ensures recalibration. That is the difference between chaos and order. That evening, the vehicle returned again, but this time it remained silent in the lot. No abrupt departures, no messages. The change in routine was itself a signal. Odigu recognized it as a deliberate, calculated step. Someone inside was acknowledging influence without confrontation. By the next morning, more subtle signals appeared. One director quietly requested private counsel on fiduciary obligations. Another sought verification of internal controls across subsidiaries. Even the compromised director reached out to a confidant, encrypted, indirect, testing the boundaries of exposure. Odigu and Chinaza remained in observation mode. They adjust faster than we predict, she murmured. Yes, he said. Structures are living. They resist only when they misinterpret force as threat. Subtlety is the tool that permits compliance without resistance. People align to architecture, not mandates. Midweek, an external consultant requested access to partially redacted logs, citing regulatory standard reviews. Odigu approved under strict conditions. The consultant's review provided additional triangulation, confirming several previously unverified intersections. A series of low-key communications followed among directors. Meetings once scheduled months in advance were moved, reconsidered, or canceled. Even minor policy proposals were delayed, rerouted, or internally debated with unusual intensity. The board was subtly rewiring itself in response to the architecture Odigu exposed. Chinaza recorded notes silently. Every movement we provoke becomes self-reinforcing, she observed. Odigu nodded. Yes. Once uncertainty enters a system, behaviors shift before directives are issued. That is the leverage point. Structural integrity responds to information, not admonition. By Friday, the first measurable acknowledgement of pressure appeared publicly. A financial newsletter highlighted the importance of transparent board oversight, cautioning firms about indirect influence from advisory networks. The article was analytical, unbiased in tone, yet the timing and specificity were unmistakable. Market analysts began referencing it in briefings, though no names were tied explicitly. Inside the organization, directors convened privately. Their discussions were cautious, deliberate, increasingly defensive in tone. Odigu observed from a distance. One of the previously hesitant directors approached him in private. "You've made transparency a weapon," the director said softly. Odigu inclined his head. Transparency is not a weapon. It is illumination. Weapons imply conflict. Conflict is reactive. Transparency is corrective. The director considered this, silently. But the optics. Optics are only meaningful if misinterpreted. The goal is structural recalibration, not reputation assault. If reputations shift, it is because architecture allowed misalignment to persist. By nightfall, the organization's digital footprint reflected subtle shifts. Audit requests doubled, review schedules advanced, advisory engagement disclosures updated. The board operated differently. Even those not directly implicated adjusted routines preemptively, aware of potential exposure. Chinaza, reviewing the progress, said quietly, "They do not yet understand the full scope." "They will," Odigu replied. "Once architecture speaks, action follows. The pattern of recalibration is predictable, but the timing is not. Observation allows anticipation." A week passed. The compromised director, once silent and controlled, began consulting extensively, carefully, almost obsessively. Reports previously deferred were now being scrutinized, cross-verified, and documented. Minor errors were corrected proactively. Behavior shifted from reactive to preemptively defensive. Chinaza studied him. "You've initiated self-correction." "Yes," Odigu said. "People correct systems only when the cost of inaction exceeds the comfort of routine. We have made inaction costly, without raising alarms. That is subtle power. Outside, the city moved as usual, unaware of the quiet adjustments in governance unfolding within boardrooms. Analysts, journalists, and regulators noticed patterns but could not attribute cause. Internally, however, the organization was learning to navigate a new equilibrium, one guided by the architecture ODIGU had illuminated. By the following Monday, the first formal acknowledgement of oversight adjustments appeared in internal memos. Directors cited enhanced review protocols, stricter disclosure procedures, and routine external verification. Language was neutral, almost perfunctory, but structurally significant. Chinaza turned to ODIGU. They've normalized correction as policy. No confrontation required. Yes, he said, voice measured. Normalization is the apex of subtle influence. The system corrects itself, and we observe without interference. Intervention becomes obsolete once architecture dictates alignment. The compromised director sent a private note, requesting clarification on newly flagged entities, offering documentation voluntarily, subtly signaling cooperation. A minor but telling shift. ODIGU read it quietly. They will continue to adjust, he said. Incrementally, quietly, inevitably. The architecture now enforces behavior. Transparency has done its work. Chinaza nodded. And the market? Market mirrors perception, he replied. Perception is now governed by corrected structure. Fragility that existed has been mitigated before it manifested publicly. Stability is restored without fanfare. The evening descended, city lights flickering across the office. ODIGU allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. This was not victory. It was architecture in motion. Self-correcting, persistent, inevitable. Every subtle adjustment, every hesitant consultation, every voluntary correction reinforced the pattern. Chinaza observed him. Expression unreadable. The system is awake. Yes, he said, tone neutral. And it will remain so until architecture demands otherwise. Outside, the vehicle returned one last time that week, silent, unobtrusive. A signal of observation, acknowledgement, but no interference. The board continued its recalibration, unaware of the full scope of influence guiding each decision, each hesitation, each alignment. ODIGU leaned back, eyes on the faint horizon. The work was far from over. But for now, the architecture was speaking, and the system was listening. BY Tuesday, subtle patterns had become unmistakable, though still unspoken. Directors adjusted their schedules in small, almost imperceptible ways. Meetings were rescheduled to accommodate deeper reviews. Previously routine briefings now included supplemental analysis. Even the compromised director, outwardly composed, had begun leaving trails of documentation that suggested meticulous, self-imposed oversight. Chinaza noticed it first in the quiet of the early morning. She had arrived ahead of ODIGU, reviewing the secure logs. Patterns are emerging faster than we anticipated, she said, voice low. They're not just responding, they're anticipating each other's responses. Yes, ODIGU agreed. Once the system understands transparency as architecture, it adapts proactively. This is more effective than any direct intervention. Control is exercised through awareness, not authority. The phone rang, interrupting the observation. ODIGU took the call, listening intently. When he hung up, he handed the note to Chinaza. A board member had requested a private meeting with internal audit to clarify previously unreported affiliations. The request was polite, almost deferential, but the implications were unmistakable. They were recalibrating behavior preemptively. We are threading influence without visible threads, ODIGU said. Every voluntary disclosure, every cautious consultation strengthens the system's self-corrective tendencies. Throughout the day, the office became a quiet hub of monitoring. Analysts compiled cross-referenced logs of advisory interactions, financial engagements, and board-level communications. Every deviation from disclosed protocol, however minor, was flagged. Every pattern of repeated omission was documented. The objective was not accusation. It was mapping the system with surgical precision. By mid-afternoon, an external auditor requested access to partial correspondence between two directors and an advisory council. Odigu approved it but with stipulations. Ensure no leaks. Keep scope limited to relevant intersections. Everything else remains confidential. The integrity of perception is as important as the integrity of facts. Chinaza observed him, noting the interplay between caution and leverage. You are shaping behavior without confrontation, she remarked. Yes, he said, almost smiling faintly. Behavior aligns faster when the system believes it is self-directed. Subtle influence is invisible because it masquerades as autonomy. That is leverage. That is power. Late afternoon brought another shift. One of the previously hesitant directors initiated an independent review of all advisory engagements over the past 3 years. The announcement was measured, procedural in tone, but the subtext was unmistakable. The board was reacting to perceived oversight, not direct pressure. Chinaza recorded notes silently. They are internalizing correction, she observed. Without realizing, they are now compliant with the standards you exposed. Odigu nodded. The system corrects itself when the cost of inaction exceeds the comfort of routine. Awareness imposes cost without confrontation. Observation replaces coercion. This is why subtlety is more effective than force. By evening, the first whispers appeared online. Careful analyses of board transparency in high-profile firms, comparisons between financial disclosures and advisory affiliations. No names were attached, but the implications were immediate. Analysts began referencing the patterns during briefings. The market, so sensitive to perception, adjusted subtly in response to these narratives. That night, Odigu and Chinaza reviewed the data again. The compromised director had left messages for several colleagues, requesting clarification on minor financial disclosures. Even the most reticent directors were now engaging in self-auditing behavior, preemptively correcting minor oversights. Chinaza spoke softly. You've created a feedback loop. They correct themselves before anyone needs to act. Yes, Odigu said, tone deliberate. Structural correction is more effective than reactive enforcement. The system now enforces standards autonomously. Intervention becomes redundant once the architecture dictates behavior. The next morning, the board convened an emergency session. The agenda was procedural, reviewing previously submitted reports, but the dynamics had shifted. Directors approached discussions with measured caution, questions were framed precisely, and disclosures were more thorough than before. The subtle pressure had altered expectations, and self-regulation had taken root. One of the directors approached Odigu quietly during a break. Your disclosure of financial intersections changed everything, he admitted. We are now reviewing each decision in context of every advisory relationship. We cannot operate as we did before. Odigu did not reply immediately. When he spoke, it was measured. Correction is not consequence. It is realignment. Once the architecture is visible, the system will self-correct without external coercion. The director nodded slowly. We understand that now. By midweek, external reports had begun framing governance transparency as a systemic risk mitigation strategy. Financial newsletters, regulatory advisories, and analytical blogs referenced the importance of documented advisory interactions and board-level integrity. The narrative, while not naming individuals or firms, reinforced the internal pressure Odigu had initiated. Chinaza noted the timing. The external narrative is reinforcing internal recalibration, she said. They are adjusting not only to your disclosures, but to perceived public expectations. Yes, Odigu said. External perception amplifies structural correction. Behavior aligns when risk is anticipated, not only when it is identified. This is why subtle influence, combined with strategic observation, is exponentially more effective than confrontation. By Thursday, the compromised director began a pattern of proactive engagement, requesting internal reviews, cross-checking documentation, and sharing data with colleagues. The shift was gradual but unmistakable. The system was not only reacting but preemptively adjusting routines and disclosures to maintain alignment with perceived standards. Chinaza studied him. He is no longer defensive. He is compliant, almost voluntarily. Odigu inclined his head. Compliance that appears voluntary is more durable than compliance compelled by force. The system now internalizes its own correction. Late in the day, a junior analyst brought a report. "Sir, there are anomalies in past board engagements that were previously overlooked. They seem minor, but when cross-referenced with advisory logs, a pattern emerges." Odiger scanned the report. Minor anomalies are the precursors of systemic fragility. Track them. Document them. Let the system address them through self-correction. Chinaza noted the analyst's subtle unease. "They realize we are observing," she said. "Yes," Odiger said. "Observation alone is a form of influence. Transparency is the mechanism through which structural integrity is enforced. They do not need to know they are being guided to act correctly. They only need to act correctly." By Friday, patterns of correction were evident across multiple board functions. Routine approvals were scrutinized more carefully, advisory engagements were transparently documented, and communication protocols were tightened. Even directors not previously implicated began following stricter standards voluntarily, aware that lapses would be observed and noted. Chinaza, reviewing the compiled logs, said quietly, "They are adapting faster than anticipated. Each self-corrective action reinforces the system further." Odigu nodded. "This is the apex of subtle influence. Once a system internalizes correction, the need for direct intervention disappears. Behavior aligns with architecture autonomously. Control is preserved without confrontation." By the weekend, minor media mentions highlighted the importance of internal governance reforms in the sector, framing them as general best practices rather than specific critiques. Yet internally, the directors treated the commentary as implicit pressure, further reinforcing self-regulatory behaviors. Monday arrived with measurable outcomes. Internal audits had flagged all previously unreported affiliations. Directors voluntarily submitted clarifications, and cross-referenced logs confirmed adjustments across the board. Every subtle shift initiated by Odigu's disclosures had generated a cascade of preemptive corrective behaviors. Chinaza observed quietly. "The system is stabilizing itself," she remarked. "Even the compromised director is now voluntarily aligned." "Yes," Odiga said, voice calm. "Stability emerges when architecture enforces behavior through perception and awareness rather than force. Influence is most durable when invisible." The board now operated differently, internally and externally. Procedural meetings were rigorous, disclosures were comprehensive, and directors coordinated more openly to mitigate systemic risk. Minor errors were corrected before they could propagate. Self-imposed scrutiny became standard practice. Odigu allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. This was not victory. It was architecture in motion, a living, self-correcting system responding to subtle, deliberate influence. Every voluntary disclosure, every preemptive correction, every cautious adjustment reinforced a structure now aware of itself. Chinaza, reviewing the patterns, said softly, "The system is no longer reactive. It is proactive." "Yes," Odiga said. "Proactivity is the measure of self-correction. Once the system enforces alignment internally, intervention becomes unnecessary. Transparency has created autonomy within compliance. That is the most enduring form of influence." Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the quiet adjustments within boardrooms. Markets began to stabilize as analysts cited improved governance practices. Internally, directors recalibrated their behavior with awareness, not instruction. The subtle tremors initiated by measured disclosures had propagated through the architecture, leaving the organization fundamentally altered. Odigu and Chinaza observed from the office, silent, methodical, watching the architecture they had awakened continue to self-correct, voluntary and resilient. The work was ongoing. The system remained alive, aware, and self-adjusting, moving under its own momentum. By the second week, the subtle recalibration of the board had begun to ripple outward into the company's broader operations. Department heads, once insulated from scrutiny, were now voluntarily cross-checking their reporting protocols. Meetings that had previously been procedural and perfunctory now included additional layers of documentation, verification, and cross-departmental review. It was almost imperceptible, but the rhythm of decision-making had shifted. Odigu and Chinaza observed from the vantage of the executive suite, quietly cataloging each minor adjustment. They think they are acting independently, Chinaza said, her tone neutral. They do not realize the architecture is guiding every choice. Precisely, Odigu replied. Self-directed compliance is stronger than externally imposed control. The system internalizes standards once the consequences of omission or oversight become apparent, even indirectly. One of the analysts entered with a report. Sir, there are new patterns emerging in subsidiary reporting. Several minor inconsistencies correlate with previous advisory overlaps. Nothing that violates law, but enough to raise internal accountability questions. Odigu scanned the sheets, noting subtle trends. Patterns are more important than isolated incidents. Small anomalies, when observed collectively, reveal the underlying architecture. Document these and feed them into the monitoring matrix. Do not intervene directly. Allow the system to self-correct. Chinaza leaned back, observing the process. The board is adapting. Every voluntary disclosure reinforces self-regulation. Even those who were initially resistant are now preemptively correcting behavior. Yes, Odigu said. The system learns. It anticipates. Correction occurs before oversight forces it. This is the apex of influence. By Wednesday, an external consultancy, unaware of the internal strategy, requested access to a set of redacted communications for a routine governance audit. Odigu approved the request selectively. Ensure that what is disclosed reinforces existing alignment. Avoid exposing gaps unnecessarily. The perception of transparency is as critical as actual transparency. Chinaza noted the precision of his approach. You are shaping behavior not only internally but externally. The market sees alignment before disruption occurs. Odigu nodded. Markets respond to perception first and fact second. A perception of stability encourages voluntary internal discipline. Misalignment corrects itself when risk appears imminent, even if the risk is only implied. By late afternoon, the compromise director initiated a personal review of advisory engagements and financial logs, forwarding summaries to select colleagues. Even the most guarded directors were now adjusting schedules, reallocating responsibilities, and refining reporting processes. The internal structure was reorganizing itself organically, responding to the architecture Odigu had illuminated. Chinaza observed quietly. Each voluntary adjustment compounds the previous one. They are effectively policing themselves without realizing it. Yes, Odigu replied. Autonomous compliance is more enduring than compliance compelled by authority. Influence persists when invisible. The system now enforces alignment autonomously. The following day, internal communications reflected these subtle recalibrations. Directors requested clarification on previously reported transactions, schedules were modified to accommodate cross-departmental oversight, and informal audits were initiated by teams who had previously been unmonitored. Chinaza remarked, "The ripple effect is stronger than we anticipated. Even divisions not initially implicated are realigning." Odigu considered the observation. Every system has nodes. When one node adapts, others must adjust to maintain structural integrity. We have triggered adaptive behavior at multiple nodes simultaneously. The architecture now governs itself. By Friday, the first measurable corporate acknowledgement appeared publicly. An official communiqué emphasized the company's commitment to governance and transparency, citing ongoing internal reviews and independent verification of advisory relationships. Language was neutral, almost perfunctory, but internally it reinforced behavioral recalibration. Directors who had previously resisted disclosure now felt compelled to conform. Chinaza reviewed the communication. Even the public narrative reinforces internal discipline. Yes, Odigu said. External acknowledgement creates feedback loops. Internal behavior adjusts in anticipation of perception. The system corrects before enforcement is required. By Monday, internal audits revealed minor discrepancies in historical reports. Normally, these would have been overlooked, but the preemptive self-corrective behavior initiated by Odigu's disclosures ensured they were addressed immediately. Directors now voluntarily documented irregularities, flagged potential conflicts, and cross-referenced financial and advisory records. Chinaza noted the pace of change. They are acting faster than anticipated. Even minor anomalies are being corrected proactively. Odigu inclined his head. Proactivity indicates internalization. Once a system anticipates correction autonomously, influence is embedded. The architecture enforces behavior without visible pressure. The week progressed with measurable adjustments across the board. Routine approvals were scrutinized with unprecedented care. Advisory engagements were now documented in real time, with explicit disclosure of potential conflicts. Even the most senior executives, previously resistant, now engaged in voluntary oversight. Chinaza observed the network of adjustments with interest. You've transformed reactive behavior into proactive governance. They are policing themselves. Yes, Odigu confirmed. Sustainable influence occurs when the system perceives oversight internally, even if no authority imposes it. They believe they are acting independently, but the architecture dictates alignment. By midweek, an external observer, a financial analyst tracking the company, published a report emphasizing industry best practices for governance. No names were mentioned, but the timing and detail were unmistakable. Internally, directors interpreted this as indirect scrutiny and responded accordingly, reinforcing self-corrective behavior. Chinaza leaned back. The external narrative amplifies internal correction. They are adjusting preemptively. Odigu nodded. Perception is leverage. When actors anticipate scrutiny, compliance becomes self-reinforcing. Influence without confrontation is enduring. By Thursday, the compromise director was actively engaging colleagues to cross-verify advisory interactions and financial disclosures. Minor reporting errors were corrected before escalation. Departments previously considered autonomous were now participating in voluntary cross-audits. The architecture of transparency was propagating through the organization like a controlled contagion. Chinaza remarked, every adjustment, every voluntary disclosure, reinforces the overall system. They no longer need prompts. Yes, Odigu said. Autonomous compliance is structural. Once behavior aligns with architecture, the system enforces itself. Intervention becomes unnecessary. By Friday evening, the network of voluntary oversight had expanded beyond the immediate board. Department heads implemented peer review mechanisms, cross-departmental reporting increased, and informal audits became standard practice. The compromise director continued proactive engagement, and even previously resistant executives adapted routines to align with anticipated standards. Chinaza observed quietly. The board is no longer reactive. They are now self-regulating. Odigu inclined his head. Stability emerges when the system internalizes correction. Influence persists invisibly when behavior aligns autonomously with architecture. This is the apex of subtle power. By the following Monday, internal metrics confirmed that nearly all previously identified gaps had been addressed. Directors were submitting comprehensive disclosures, advisory engagements were fully documented, and compliance protocols were enforced voluntarily. Even minor errors were corrected preemptively. Chinaza recorded the progress. They've internalized accountability. Every voluntary action strengthens structural integrity. Yes, Odigu said. Autonomous compliance ensures durability. Once the system enforces alignment internally, no external pressure is required. The architecture now dictates behavior. External narratives continued to reinforce internal adjustments. Market analysts referenced the company's strengthened governance protocols, regulatory commentators highlighted best practices, and financial newsletters praised proactive compliance. The market absorbed these narratives, stabilizing perception without disruption. Internally, directors coordinated across departments more effectively, verified reporting through multiple channels, and initiated internal controls that had previously been overlooked. Minor discrepancies were addressed immediately, and advisory interactions were documented thoroughly. Chinaza observed quietly. Every self-corrective measure reinforces the architecture. They are voluntarily policing themselves, unaware of the invisible influence guiding them. Odigu leaned back. Autonomous behavior is sustainable. Intervention is redundant once alignment is internalized. Transparency has created self-regulating structures. Influence now exists in perpetuity through the architecture itself. By the end of the week, the organization had shifted fundamentally. Patterns of voluntary oversight, proactive reporting, and cross-verification were now standard practice. Directors who had initially resisted disclosure were now actively engaged in monitoring, coordinating, and documenting processes to ensure compliance. Chinaza noted the final measure. The system is no longer simply reactive. It anticipates, adjusts, and enforces itself. Every ripple we initiated has propagated fully. Yes, Odigo said, voice calm. The architecture is awake. It will continue to self-correct, enforce alignment, and preserve structural integrity without further guidance. Influence persists invisibly, and behavior is now dictated by internalized transparency. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the subtle recalibration within the boardroom. Markets reflected stability, external narratives praised governance, and internally, behavior had been fundamentally transformed. The system continued to operate under the subtle, invisible influence initiated weeks prior, self-regulating, anticipatory, and enduring. Odigo and Chinaza watched silently, cataloging the final patterns of adjustment. The system had learned to correct itself, voluntary and proactive, guided by architecture rather than authority. Every voluntary disclosure, every preemptive correction, and every cautious adjustment reinforced the structure they had awakened. For now, the organization operated under a new equilibrium. Transparency, subtly imposed and internally absorbed, had created autonomous compliance. Behavior was now enforced by architecture, not confrontation. The work had not ended, it would never truly end, but the system was alive, responsive, and self-regulating. By the following week, Odigo and Chinaza had begun to track subtle behavioral shifts beyond the immediate boardroom. Department heads, who had previously operated independently, were now submitting voluntary reconciliations of internal audits. Teams that once reported in silos were initiating cross-departmental reviews without prompt. Even minor discrepancies in advisory engagement documentation were being flagged preemptively. The architecture was extending its influence outward, and the pattern of self-regulation had begun to propagate through layers of the organization that had previously been insulated. Chinaza, standing by the observation console, pointed to the data feed. Even divisions we didn't target directly are correcting themselves. They're internalizing standards we never explicitly imposed. Odigo watched quietly, voice calm. That is the nature of structural influence. When the system perceives oversight, even indirectly, behavior aligns voluntarily. The architecture enforces itself. Subtlety ensures compliance is durable. An analyst entered the room with a printout. Sir, the compromised director has requested a complete verification of past 3 years of advisory interactions across multiple subsidiaries. They're coordinating with finance and legal internally. No external directive. This is self-initiated. Odigo scanned the documents. Self-directed compliance is more sustainable than externally imposed mandates. The system now enforces alignment through awareness rather than authority. Document the process. Continue monitoring the interactions without interference. Chinaza recorded notes. Every voluntary action amplifies the effect. The system corrects itself, anticipating potential discrepancies before escalation. Yes, Odigo said. The objective is structural awareness, not confrontation. Behavior that aligns with architecture is more enduring than behavior imposed by enforcement. Observation catalyzes correction, and the correction is now autonomous. By midweek, subtle shifts began appearing in communications with external partners. Advisory councils and regulatory liaisons were receiving more detailed and timely documentation than previously required. Directors who had resisted disclosure earlier were now forwarding relevant correspondence voluntarily. External stakeholders interpreted these changes as procedural diligence rather than internal pressure. But internally, every voluntary disclosure reinforced the structural influence Odigo had initiated. A senior analyst approached. Sir, there are anomalies in cross-departmental reporting. minor timing inconsistencies and slight overlaps in advisory logs. Normally, these would have gone unnoticed, but they're being corrected preemptively. Odigu nodded. Patterns of alignment are more important than isolated errors. Document these and feed them into the monitoring framework. The system is now self-correcting. Do not intervene directly. Let autonomous compliance continue to propagate. Chinaza, observing quietly, said, "The system is learning to correct itself. They are anticipating oversight even when none is imposed externally." "Yes," Odigu replied. "Autonomous correction is the apex of influence. Once behavior aligns internally with architecture, enforcement becomes redundant. Each voluntary adjustment strengthens the structure and propagates self-regulation further." By Thursday, the network of voluntary oversight had extended further. Directors requested clarifications from internal audit preemptively, cross-referenced advisory logs, and submitted reconciliations of past interactions. Departments that previously acted in isolation began voluntary peer review of financial and operational reports. Even minor discrepancies were corrected immediately, often before formal audits flagged them. The architecture of transparency was now operating as a fully self-reinforcing system. Chinaza observed the network of adjustments, noting each self-corrective measure. They no longer require prompts. Behavior aligns with architecture voluntarily. "Yes," Odigu said. "Influence is most durable when invisible. The system now enforces alignment autonomously, without any explicit pressure. This is structural power at its peak." By Friday, a quiet acknowledgement surfaced publicly in industry channels. Analysts and commentators noted improved internal controls across the sector, citing enhanced transparency in advisory relationships as a best practice. The language was neutral, devoid of direct critique, but internally it amplified the pressure for directors to maintain voluntary oversight. Even those previously resistant interpreted this as indirect scrutiny. Chinaza commented, "The market and external observers are reinforcing the internal recalibration. Directors perceive oversight even when it's only implied." Odigu nodded. "Perception is leverage. Anticipation drives alignment more reliably than correction. Behavior internalizes when the cost of omission is perceived, not enforced." By the following Monday, internal metrics confirmed the system.